Hi, my name is Simon. Let's start this session by reminding ourselves where we are at. It is the year 800 AD. In Western Europe, Charlemagne was king of the Franks. Later, that entire area would be called the Holy Roman Empire, and it included northern Italy, central Italy, France, and the majority of today's Germany. Charlemagne, he had an ongoing agreement with the Pope. The accord increased the power of the Papal State in central Italy, but Charlemagne had to share power in an indirect way. In the Iberian peninsula, the Umayyad Sunni Muslim Emirate was well established. It was an Arab country. It was later declared the Caliphate of Cordova. It would last for almost 300 years. However, by 1031 it had gone through some delamination. It became a loose assembly of about 30 different self-ruling city-states, many of which fought one another. This would soon be the end of it. The Christian kingdoms, which were surrounding the Iberian peninsula, were already in the process of reconquering Iberia. I am showing a map here in the background. By the 11th century, the reconquest shifted into a higher gear, but it'll still be a while. And in the southern point of Iberia was Granada. Granada was a large Muslim Berber state, not Arab. I remind you that the Berbers are not Arabs. Granada was well protected by the Sierra and the Mediterranean Sea. It would take another 500 years for it to dissolve. Granada is a big player in the story. We have yet to discuss it. We will talk about the massacre of 1066 in the next chapter. We are now moving east to the Mediterranean. In Iraq and Syria of today, along the Euphrates River, the Abbasid Sunni Muslim Caliphate was running affairs. They were Arabs as well, a different people though than the Umayyads of Spain, not as tolerant of other religions. At this time it was ruled by the well-known, well to some, Harun al-Rashid. He is known mostly from the stories about Sinbad the Sailor and 1,000 Arabian Nights. Harun al-Rashid and later the Abbasid the caliphs who followed, produced a great deal of written work. They had many of the known books of the time translated to Arabic. Paper was produced locally. That was a game changer. It enabled Baghdad to become a center of learning, of philosophy and religious mysticism. I'm reminding that paper was not just for wiping our private parts. It actually was a game changer, just like print became a game changer in the 16th century. In North Africa, Jews at the time were generally comfortable. I say generally because no one was actually comfortable then. Morocco, for example, was divided. According to Arab historians, part of it was so-called governed, and they were run by the Arabs, and another big chunk was in chaos, and it was run by the Berber tribes. The Berbers were the original inhabitants of North Africa. Jews had their circumstances change for each new caliph and for each Berber chieftain. It's important to remember that despite the fact that Jews were living through religious discrimination, pogroms, ethnic riots, bullying by their own people and by the other religions, famine, plague, getting tossed around from place to place, that was life at the time for many people. I assure you that farming folks in England and France did not feel any safer and didn't fare much better. They might have complained less, but I doubt that too. From time to time, a shift in the power play created undesirable implications for Jewish communities. In the 8th century in Morocco, for example, a Shiite caliphate called the Idrisids took over. The Idrisids ruled till the 10th century. Under them, in Morocco, Jews had their civil rights severely restricted, and many times they were forced to convert to Islam or die as martyrs. Conversion often constituted a superior choice. I'm going to mention the name Karaite Jews just briefly, and then I'll explain about them, so don't look them up. I will give you a little brief. But first, let's talk about Egypt. Egypt made a home to many Jews, among which was a large community of Karaite Jews, of whom we will have to talk about soon. During the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate in Egypt, same people that were in Baghdad, were overrun by a new Shiite Caliphate, which were called the Fatimids. And the Fatimids introduced new restrictions on the non-Shiite population. They were especially hard on the poor Sunni Muslims, but also on the Christians and the Jews. A famous caliph of the Fatimids was Al-Hakim. He was both famous and somewhat controversial. He ruled till his disappearance in 1021, and during his reign, synagogues, churches, as well as Sunni Muslim mosques were destroyed. The Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem was too destroyed, although it was already in a pretty bad way. Al-Hakim is considered by some to be a saint and a Mahdi. A Mahdi is a Shiite Muslim equivalent to the Messiah. Let's hop over for a moment to Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. There were some restrictions on the Jews there, but there were restrictions on everyone those days. Under the Caliphate of Cordova, Jews were able to practice openly, participate in many activities, actually gain status and power in some cases. Jews spoke Arabic. They wrote Hebrew in Arabic script. We have a great deal of correspondence from that period. Still, the so-called Golden Age of Iberian Jews has yet to come. Also, as the Christian side of Iberia grew, there was a growing Jewish community there as well, especially in places like Castilla and Leon and Aragon. We will talk about that community in a future chapter. The Jewish centers of Mesopotamia had been inching their way slowly towards Baghdad. In the Islamic Empire, the scholastic rabbinical leaders, which were called Geonim, were dishing out new religious instructions right and left, and there was 600 years of correspondence of how to do things. Not everyone agreed with the authority of the rabbinical centers, nor with all the Jewish practice rules. A quiet Jewish breakaway group was forming, breaking away quietly from the rabbinical religious practice. These non-conformation groups that were breaking away from rabbinical authority were especially felt outside Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Asia, in Persia, around the Byzantine Empire. It was thought that this movement started as far back as 600 years earlier, during the 1st century, when many Sadducees, Jew practitioners, were living in Alexandria. After the Great Revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple, more Sadducees moved south. Although hundreds of years had gone by, it is considered likely that these Sadducees made the core of the non-rabbinical Jewish tradition. Sometime in the 8th century, a formal breach had formed between the established rabbinical authority in Mesopotamia and some of the diaspora communities of the rest of the world. A new Jewish denomination was in the making. They were called the Karaites. The Karaites openly rejected the rabbinical instruction and proposed to go by the Hebrew Bible as their only authority. Of course, eventually they made up their own rules. But by the 11th century, there were almost as many Karaite Jews as were rabbinical Jews. Needless to say, those two Jewish denominations did not get along that well. But from my understanding, nobody ever did. During those centuries, Jews were moving from Italy into southwestern Europe, mostly to an area called the Rhineland, but also to France. They concentrated in known towns. They lived in Worms, in Speyer, in Mainz, along and between the Rhine and the Loire rivers. They had their own rabbinical establishment. Later they were called Baalei Tosafot. Those days the Franks were tolerant of the Jews to some extent. Europe was run by the feudal system. They had knights, burgesses, priests, peasants. Jews were useful in trade and administration. They had connections. They understood banking and medicine. And they were loyal. Well, they couldn't exactly afford not to be. We already know that there were Jews living in the Papal State in central Italy. Now, they were protected from violence, allowed to survive, but were forbidden to attain equal status to Christians. To protect them, often they lived in their own neighborhood. Later we hear more about settlements in the south of France, Aquitaine, along the Spanish border, in the area then called Provence. France was ruled by Charlemagne's son, Louis. In 825, Holy Roman Emperor Louis, son of Charlemagne, issued a charter of protection for the Jews. It encouraged Jewish trade and relaxed political restrictions. In order to understand better European Jewish history, it is important to remember the majority of Jews lived under Muslim rule at the time. Over the years, West European Jewish population had begun to form a separate practice and conform to some standards of the European ways. European Jews became known as Ashkenazi Jews. In the 11th century, by Ashkenazi standards, the pleasurable practice of polygamism was ruled out. We will discuss that in the next chapter. But in Morocco, they're still trying to get over that. In the realm of religion, something else was happening. Mysticism had gained ground throughout much of the religious world. Jewish mysticism, too, had developed alongside Muslim and Christian research into the occult. Jews were forever preoccupied with the future coming of the Messiah. Part of mysticism was the attempt to foresee the exact timing of his arrival. But it was also the nature of the Messiah which kept people busy. A great deal of religious thought was in an attempt to understand the relationship between man and God. Also, a lot of philosophical work into understanding how man's fate and reality are intertwined. Was reality predetermined by God? Or was there individual choice? Or perhaps both? I feel it's time to address a question which we have all had our minds at some time. Why didn't they just convert? After all, what's the big deal? Islam believes in the same God and in the same prophets. All you had to do is add one prophet and you're there. Isn't life too precious to lose for a single prophet? And Muhammad was a mensch, and he introduced a lovely message. Now this question is not easy for someone such as myself to answer. In reality, they did convert. Some went into the direction of Islam, some Jews converted to Christianity, and some, God forbid, lived a dual spiritual life. Now, many of these conversions have lasted till this very day. It is known that some Jewish reconverted back when time and place allowed it, but as far as many, we don't really know. Every once in a while we hear of a Christian or a Muslim family with Jewish roots. One recognizes customs and family names, so it makes you wonder. In any event, we will revisit the issue of conversion when we talk about the 16th century. For now, it stands. I feel a little uncomfortable. We left out Byzantine. Yes, we have to go back there, because the story of the Byzantine Empire Jews is yet to happen. They had enjoyed a steady state of discrimination. The Macedonian dynasty that ruled throughout this period had adopted many of the religious decrees of Emperor Justinian's Codex. Those were indeed outdated. They were written in the 6th century. Fortunately for some, it had become difficult to implement many of those anti-Jewish decrees. Times were changing, but strangely enough, people were not. Nevertheless, in the Byzantine Empire, Jews were kept away from many professional positions as well as land ownership. But they were left to practice Judaism undisturbed for most parts. Byzantine was far too busy protecting its borders from the encroaching Arabs and the Bulgarians to worry about the Jews. Guys, thank you all for staying till the end of this chapter. Please like and subscribe, because it makes me feel good. If you wish to hear more, of course, write me a note. We are going to slide away for now. Time for a well-deserved break. The 9th and 11th centuries are slightly less informative than the future. These years are still considered somewhat of the dark ages for many. We don't have a great deal of information that survived. But things are going to change. We look at the rest of the 11th century in a different chapter. From now, information is more available. It is getting a little more interesting as well.